All right, so this is the image that came up on the desktop for today, and as the beginning or inspiration or point of departure for what we're referring to as desktop ekphrasis series and the continuation of my discussion of the work of Barnett Newman, specifically as I've referred to it as Notes Toward an Understanding of the Conceptual Sublime in the material works of Barnett Newman. And you'll catch that the conceptual sublime in material, the adjective material is underscored because what in fact we're doing is trying to argue that the conceptual in conceptual art is not a matter of being immaterial, but a stance in relationship to strategies of representation. And in that sense, this stone could be just as much an example of conceptual art as any missing object, say in the gesture of Yoko Ono describing the way that an imaginary nail might be driven into an imaginary wall, right? I wonder if that number would give me I can't quite recall where this boundary stone is situated and either where it's situated and what it's referred to, and I wonder if this number, which itself is somewhat difficult to perceive, I can't entirely determine whether that's 253. Obviously, it was that number was carved into this stone much later than the stone was actually placed in this location. This is you could refer to this as an uncarved or an uncut monolith, and in that simple way relates to the obelisks, which of course we've underscored is a Greek word for the tikhenu, the Egyptian word for what the Egyptians referred to as the word that the Egyptians used to refer to what we refer to today, using the Greek word obelisk. And the Greek word obelisk suggests, spit or skewer or something that pierces, when in fact the Egyptian symbolism, for these monoliths, single pieces of stone, right? And in that sense, if we go back to the Egyptian construction of these images, they were always unbroken stone, right? And that'll become important later in our discussion of what it means to be and to be signified as a broken obelisk. But these were monolithic representations of shafts of light, and this stone, although a monolith, clearly is not a representation of a shaft of light, but refers more closely and sort of proto originally to this other Egyptian form, again, which is the Greek word we have for that is pyramid, which I believe is derived etymologically from a Greek expression that means stack, perhaps stack of wheat cakes, but But the Egyptian word mer or mir or is a little difficult to determine what the pronunciation might have been, because let's see if I can find it. So this is the hieroglyph for pyramid, and you see, I know if you recall from our discussion yesterday, there's a determinant there, and that is itself this cone-like representation of a pyramid, and then in this form of the lexeme that exists beside it, and this word relates to a heap, the idea of a heap of stones or a mound. We've related it to this idea of the primordial mound or the mountain, and you see how it relates, philologically to these other Proto-Afro-Asiatic cognates and Arabic cognates: heap of stones, marker, dividing wall, pile of bricks, to be high, to be raised. So all of these ideas of something raising stone or earth into the form of a mound and raising it toward the sky, either as a marker or as a symbolically significant religious locus, and locus being in this case a holy locus, and therefore a center, so a kind of axis mundi, right? The center of the world, and and in that sense, and we'll get there. But actually, I want to, before we even do that and begin talking about the relationship between this image as boundary stone and the way that marking a center and the center of the world, and the way that a holy mountain becomes a vehicle between the quotidian mundane and the divine, and why for example churches are situated on hills, or holy sites are often represented as mountains, and why it is that Moses receives the tablets of the law on a mountain, and that the appearances of the divine, no matter what religion we're talking about, often occurs on a mountain. That the mountaintop is where the Holy One speaks with the divine. How all of those ideas relate to these large stones as mounds and piles and pyramids and mirror and whatever one might refer to them as. Before getting to all of that and all of that's relationship to Barnett Newman, and specifically to the work of Barnett Newman, which I think began in around 1963. I have to check that actually. I could easily be mistaken about that, but let's look up and find the date for these broken obelisks before we proceed any further. Let's see if I guess we have to include Barnett Newman. There we go. Get a date. Okay, yes, between 1963 and 1967, and go back to our boundary stone. So before we get to that, and this large stone uncarved monoliths relationship, at least originating, relationship, and then transformation into the idea of a boundary stone, to this primordial mound, center of the earth, mountain, holy space, where the earth touches sky. And what's missing, right, in the title of the Barnett Newman piece, because even though in the physical material representation of the broken obelisk, the word obelisk is referenced, which is in fact, right, already a Greek historical take, an observance of these tekenu, and a reassigning a Greek name to these tekenu, these shafts of light, represented in monolithic carved stone form, right? That piece, the upside down broken obelisk or broken tekenu, is referenced in the title, but the primordial mound or pyramid, if you want to use the Greek word that refers to the stacking, is not referenced in the piece, right? So that is interesting, too, as a beginning point, that we begin here with what's absent in at least the title of broken obelisks, and but clearly, visible in the construction of the piece, in which these broken obelisks are situated upside down on an upright pyramid, right? So before we proceed with that, and further into the discussion of Barnett Newman and the conceptual sublime in the materiality of his work, I had done an internet search on boundary stones, and this is what I found, which I thought was really interesting. Okay, so this is something written by Richard Curtis, and he appears to be some kind of conservative Christian, and this article seems to be supporting some misreading of Christian virtue and traditional values that are found in this proverb of that relates to ancient boundary stones set up by your ancestors. Okay, now before I proceed too much further, I want to point out that the relationship between these boundary stones and what follows in this article about the metaphor of boundary stone as sexual interdiction and these rules against certain kinds of sexual relationships and sexualities is specious and ahistorical, but these types of conservative Christian arguments tend to be completely specious and ahistorical. So it's not at all surprising, right? Just like it's completely specious and ahistorical to imagine that in the time of Christ or before the time of Christ in the Judaic tradition, that there was any interdiction whatsoever on abortion, when in fact abortions were not only common, but in terms of traditions of midwives and women's medicine, there were all kinds of not only practices, but long traditions and both oral traditions and some examples of textual descriptions of methods for inducing abortion. in any case, what this becomes is utilizing this quotation from the book of Proverbs, right, and the wisdom of Solomon, to say that reimagining, our laws of marriage and gender and the distribution of our pronouns is like moving an ancient boundary stone, and that one shouldn't move these ancient boundary stones because Solomon tells us that this is unwise in this particular proverb. And this isn't a space-time travel communication coordinate, but if it were, we could refer to it as such, and it would have this specific coordinate 22, 28. Actually, just in compare, let's see, compare it with our our space-time travel communication coordinates and see what it might be. I don't know why, but perversely, curious as to what the coincidence of this coordinate and the coordinates that we're using often are. So 22, under the first section, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21. 22, and what was the number? And these are, again, time-specific coordinates that we're using. Of course, this is not this is an eternal coordinate, right? It doesn't change. No one gets to rewrite the Proverbs and add or subtract like we do. So 28, that's 16. Let's just go to 32 and subtract. Okay, so this coordinate corresponds with this particular. All right, so we'll play that in the background as I'm describing this argument about moving the boundary stones, and then I'll mute that later. But let's see if there's anything of I'll just I'm not going to read the entire thing, but I'll read the last two paragraphs. So this argument, that begins with this idea of moving boundary stones, and think of how the values in our society have changed, and of course, like the implication is, and we're moving all these boundary stones and then changing our map of the world, and we're not supposed to do this because our ancestors built these boundary stones, and they must have had a good reason for it. The moment life begins has been redefined. Okay, actually, that's it's been redefined, most entirely, and certainly recently, once, as I stated earlier, there's no reason to believe that in either Christ's time or much prior to that in the history of Judaism that anyone had any problem with the idea of abortion and determination of pregnancy. Marriage has been redefined, another boundary stone moved, and how this is a violation of Solomon's wisdom. Very recently, even the secular definition of gender is beginning to change. Okay, and so I guess what I'm interested in, before we get into the Barnett Newman is how did we get from this idea the Holy One, climbing the mountain, and upon that, axis mundi, or axis of the center of earthly existence, making contact with the light of the divine. How did we get from there to the king's division of the countryside into usable property territories marked by boundary stones, and I guess the regulation of forms and functions of sexual identity and sexuality as again sort of usable divisions in the hierarchization of identities and within a culture, and of course in relationship to those usable or unusable identities, the idea of exclusion and what is included, and so the holy moment of contact with the divine becoming this way of mapping not only the territories of our earthly existence as embodied embodiments of property rights, but also our very bodies and our very subjectivities of desire in relationship and in sort of analogous parallelism to the mappings of that territory. And although it seems like an irrelevant aside or digression, I think it'll lurk in the background of what this idea of the broken obelisk or broken tekenu actually might mean, and at what point did it become broken? I mean, in effect, is are the tablets that Moses carves from that holy mountain in fact one of the earliest examples of something that's always broken, right? A broken piece of the monolithic primordial mound, broken into a tablet upon which someone can write a series of laws and interdictions against certain forms of behavior. Is that not already a broken shaft of light? In other words, the experience of the oneness and unity with the divine becomes a series of rules and regulations that define a community's codes and relationships to itself, rather than to the divine and the experience of the divine. And the divine, once those pieces of stone are torn from the mountain, and the meaning of the mountain is lost and reinscribed with a series of Leviticus-like forbiddings. The nature of the divine is effectively transformed in and of itself, and the meeting with the divine on the holy mountain is transformed into a definition of a community that a tribal definition of a community that is defined precisely in terms of its exclusion of the other and its ability, right, to regulate the acceptance versus rejection of individuals who fall outside of the codes that establish that continuity of community. And here I'm focusing on sort of inverted relation to this idea of fortress, which we've referred to before. Inverted as like, what becomes made of this word of fortress. I say inverted here as fortress is a definition of security, and to burglarize, is to violate, that idea, and in a certain sense, one could say, flipping it on its head, in the same way that the broken shaft of light, is flipped upside down in Barnett Newman's broken obelisks. So all of that in the background, and we'll slowly mute. We'll slowly mute the musical reference. As we return to a discussion of Barnett Newman and the various broken tekenu that constitute this work, created from the period of 1963 through 1967. And I'm seeing what appears to be a defacement of one of these images, and I'm going to click on it because one of the things that it suggests to me, and it seems to be a swastika inscribed on the base of this pyramid, and one of the things that this defacement suggests to me is that there must have been an understanding of the meaning of this work, and the way that I'm reading it as a profoundly and deeply moving, philosophical and spiritual understanding of what it means to exist in a time after terror, and I find that interesting because I don't think of the perpetrators of this kind of vandalism as generally having insight into these kinds of conceptualizations of these profound spiritualities. And yet, I guess this occurred in 1979, a gathering, and then there's a gathering here, and I guess in response to the hate speech inscribed upon what is probably arguably one of the most significant not only sculptural works but spiritual works of the 20th century. A gathering to denounce racism after the vandalization. It's interesting that it's referred to vandalization. The word vandalization in relationship to the broken obelisk is not strong enough, and there's so much here. There's so much here that requires unpacking that it begins to become difficult to do so, because we haven't reached that point at which we can begin to talk about these things yet. because we haven't, fully elaborated the significance of that broken shaft of light, from the divine, and when it was broken, and all of the ways in which it has been broken over time and history. But certainly one of the breakings of the symbolism of the divine is the breaking that exists in the use of the swastika itself, which is a very ancient symbol of the turning of the sun, and or the turning of the sun, or the turning of time, or the rotation of the sun, and the rotation that is represented in time, and the beams of the swastika as they exist in not only Native American symbolism, but in the symbolism of as it's used in India and in the Middle East, was a defined symbol of both movement and the articulation of the directions and of the life affirming and giving powers of the sun, and in a sense to be utilized as a symbol of the destruction of this agency of fascist totalitarianism and world destruction. To utilize that symbol was to break it. Just as those so-called Christians who utilize the cross today, to and yesterday, to enslave peoples and to create a system of subservient labor, and I'm referring to the missions in the west of the United States, under this colonial imperialism of Catholicism and the ownership of individuals in the New World, and I'm referring to Christian use of symbolic and thematic iconographies, to enslave, African people, just like the use of the cross in historical long, durations of historical periods, as are defined by instances, such as the Spanish Inquisition, was to break, the holy significance of the image, of the cross, and the extent to which, the cross is broken by those historical incidents and terrors, across time, is I suppose, open to question and interpretation. But the new alliance, right, of fascism, totalitarianism, and archaic misreadings of boundary stones, certainly isn't helping maintain the integrity of that particular shaft of light. If you imagine the religious significance of the cross as another example of the Holy One, standing on the mound, or holy space of the mountain, and touching the divine light of the sky, in this instance, in his death. And you could imagine within the iconography and iconology of the symbol of the cross, the vertical aspect of the cross representing, the movement of the divine, downwards towards the one existent, the Holy One on earth, and additionally the movement of the Holy One to the divine in the verticality of that particular icon. And you could imagine within that icon of the cross the horizontal crossbeam as representative of the fact of the earthly existence, the flat quotidian plane of our lives, and as it is situated, as a crossbeam in this becoming of the holy, and all of those instances, in which the meaning of that sacred symbol, right, is used in direct and contradictory fashion to what is intended by it, right? Because what was always intended was the message of the Sermon on the Mount, which is also, right, a primordial mound, and what its meaning was that the Spirit, is always with us, and what the Spirit speaks of is of the healing of our brothers and sisters, and the holiness of each and every living thing, and the failure to recognize in the other the holiness of oneself and of the above is in fact, the failure of the Spirit, and so already, the broken figure on the cross, crying out to the Creator, why have you forsaken me, is in a way a questioning of why have they not understood the holy message of touching the divine on the mountain that was the Beatitudes, right? And that was spoken, and that and could have been followed, and why has this turned to blood? And we can ask the same question of this symbol. Why has this turned to blood? And it's so moving to see this circle of individuals gathered at this place of the broken obelisk, that always already the broken obelisk spoke of the transformation of the symbol of light into a symbol of destruction, and questioned it in this searching and deeply effective and moving way, whose sort of coded use of this apparently abstract set of symbols, like, even for me, even makes it more powerful than if it had been spelled out in a more obvious way, right? And so the reading of the work and the inscription on it gets perhaps part of the statement, but ironically, fails to recognize that even in inscribing this is how powerful the Newman actually is. That even inscribing the swastika on it only speaks and reinforces, the statement that the Tekhenu is broken, and broken in so many ways. And in the title of the piece, Broken Obelisk, is already the statement that the swastika is a broken holy symbol, and that perhaps that symbol can never be used again. And even though it may be continued to be used, I know that the twirling logs are sometimes used as a representation in Navajo sand painting, the whirling logs, and I've argued that the symbol is broken, and that Newman was right, and that it can't be used, and I'm beginning to formulate an argument, a similar argument in relationship to the Holy Cross, that the symbol is broken and perhaps should not be used, and this will again be a very unpopular opinion, and it will be a very unpopular statement, and it will depend on the weight, the ethics, and the weight that we assign to certain violations of humanity. And for example, Pope Pius XII's meetings with Adolf Hitler and his alliance with a fascism that resulted in the destruction and genocide of human peoples, and the weight and the ethical gravity that we assign to historical periods, long historical period, such as the Spanish Inquisition and all of the destruction that resulted from it, and of the destruction of human life that will result from these arguments that somehow life begins in either the testicles or the ovaries, and women will die. Because there has always been abortion, and there always will be, and there has always been sex, and there always will be, and there has always been sexuality, and there always will be. But the difference is, whether people will die because they're not receiving the proper science and care, or whether people will live because we recognize the reality of the facts, and actually, do care about individuals and health and lives, and so the continued perpetration of crimes against humanity, and I do argue that that these new laws, banning a woman's right to choose what to do with her body, and to decide, whether an abortion is something that she wishes to choose over having a child. I do think that the abolishment of these laws of choice are crimes against humanity, and if they're done, symbolically in the name of these traditional values that relate to holy symbols like the cross, then they break, the value of these symbols in the same way, that the Nazis, irreversibly broke the holiness, and the symbolic, significance of this particular symbol that cannot be used, right, anymore. And I'm arguing that all of this is already there in Newman's construction of these obelisks turned upside down. on these pyramids, and they're there conceptually and symbolically, for all of the reasons that I've been discussing, and again, we're sort of moving toward a clearer and more articulate understanding articulated understanding of what I mean by all of this, but we're getting there, and I'm not quite sure what image that we want to use to get there entirely, but let's move away from this moment in 1979 and return elsewhere. All right, so this again is the title of the piece that was our initial distraction. We no longer need to talk about that anymore. Let's come back to this image. This is the hieroglyph for the ancient Egyptian word for pyramid, and although it's the word pyramid is absent, and the word mir is or mare is absent in the Barnett Newman description that provides the title for this series of work that belong to this name, broken obelisk. The pyramid is clearly represented, and it clearly forms the base upon which the broken obelisk, not odalisque, which would be a parataxia, is situated, right? Right. So it's part of the materiality of the work, but it isn't named, and only the odalisque is named. Now, in Egyptian constructions of these two different kinds of objects, the tekenu and the mir was never monolithic in the same way that this boundary stone is a monolith, right? This boundary stone is clearly a single piece of stone. Now, it's resting on some kind of a pedestal that was probably added, later or around this stone, and then these smaller stones and what appear to be broken glass bottles, maybe beer bottles or something else, but that are, one imagines, temporary, and compared to the longer duration of this boundary stone's lifespan. But this is clearly a monolith. Now, what I'm arguing in relationship to the Newman piece is that this monolith, the boundary stone, derives from an earlier idea of the mound that is only symbolically monolithic. That is, that it may represent a stone mountain and a singularity. But these objects, as they were constructed as representation, were never monoliths. The pyramids of the ancient Egyptians were highly constructed artifacts of many thousands of stones and other building materials that were put together to construct these images. And Hegel, has something to say about the symbolic in art and its evolution, towards this kind of classical humanism, and he puts very rigid hierarchical values on what it could be called like a kind of evolution of this movement, towards the human sublime, from the mere symbolic. What's interesting in the Newman is that again he seems to flip that on its head and returning to these symbolic values, points that that there's something deeper even than the representation of the pictorial human in the images of the Renaissance, and we'll see a similar kind of image, in let's see if I can get a bigger version of it. Oh, in this depiction, by Michelangelo. Now imagine that, okay. Imagine here in the creation of Adam that that the fingers, and I believe that Lyotard, points this out, but I may be wrong. The connection between the Newman and this pictorial representation of touching the divine, the human and the divine, right? Imagine that Adam here is the representation of the primordial mound, the mountain, upon which the earthly being touches the Creator. And here it's interesting because the Creator is reaching down to his existence on earth and providing life out of the clay. Adam was given life, and this, one can imagine, right, that that the finger of God is the shaft of light, the shaft of the divine, but not represented here in monolithic stone, here represented in the human form divine, as Blake refers to it, right? And in Hegel, there's this entire sort of quasi colonialist argument about the evolution of art and its finding its form in this moment in the Renaissance, in the embodiment of the human figure itself. And then he argues in the Romantic period it even transcends that, and when the model becomes like the interior speaking subject, as in the lyric poet, right? It's no longer the physical body that represents this moment of the contact between the earthly and divine, but rather it occurs somewhere in here in Adam's head and the voice and the speaking, and the movement for Hegel moves from sculptural to painterly pictorial, as it moves away from symbolic into expression of the human form and body, and then it moves, into the more strictly verbal, and I suppose could be textual as well, when this moment, is expressed as the thought, and of course, as a philosopher, Hegel wanted to privilege thought, and what he imagined thought was very closely aligned to what he imagined language was. All right. So, but one can see, and if I turned the let's see if I make sure that I'm doing this correctly. We want to get it on top, right? If I turn this, to the proper angle, you can see that the holy is now above and touching the earthly below, and that in some way, perhaps, one could imagine this as an expression in human bodily form of precisely what those tekenu represent. All right, so let's move away from this back to these various images of the Newman, and what I want to discuss at this point, because I think we have enough information on the table, is, what does it mean for the tekenu to be broken? And I shouldn't have closed the image of the Michelangelo, because in relationship to the Michelangelo, it would mean that the finger of God, was in some sense broken, or it would mean that the divine light, was in some sense broken. And what could break, the divine light? And I suppose what could break the divine light would be something like, the Holocaust, and what could break the divine light would be something like its use as a symbol to destroy, human life. And not only was the symbol broken, right, as it is here, but the very relationship. So what you have in the Newman is a broken symbol, like and Hegel would have argued this. You can't use the symbol anymore because as art evolves, it transcends this. But what Newman is saying is that is asking this question is when it was broken and what breaks it. And was it, and is it broken because it turns back to the symbolic and reimagines these relationships between these, archaic structural forms as they existed in Egypt and the way that they were utilized symbolically then? Or, does it break from other and more complicated reasons? And when, did it break, and in how many ways is it broken? The obelisk that is the Washington Monument was built, quite early on, from 1848 to 1854. So it's situated interestingly within that period, in which American history is deciding the meaning of what it is to belong and to have rights, and what it is to own, and to deprive individuals of rights. And it's situated, its construction is situated right in the span of that period of the Civil War and the emancipation of slavery, and it is in that sense interesting as an icon to choose for the expression of these ideas that Newman seems to be expressing. Now, there are a lot of ways to express any idea, and there was nothing about an obelisk per se that said that this is the image of the broken shaft of light that you have to utilize, and that you have to discuss the way that its original construction as a monolith, because unlike the pyramid, the Egyptians made these tekenu out of a single stone, and it was a carved single stone. So it was different from this boundary stone in the sense that this boundary stone wasn't carved, but it was like this boundary stone in the sense that it was a monolith. And the pyramids were like that boundary stone in the sense that they represented, probably at one point a primordial mound or hill or holy space, and then they were later degraded into these markings of ownership, right? But by the time they were utilized in the construction of the Washington Monument, what we know as the Washington Monument. The Washington Monument is not a monolith. It's a highly constructed work of architecture, that has a surface of thin walls, of only 7-inch thick walls that are in fact marble, and its base is, you can't really see here, but it is clearly distinct from the tower that rises above it, both in material, design and in construction. And if one imagines that there's an argument in monolithic, the monolithic construct, right, of the beam of light, the fact that light, the image of light and the divine light, is carved from a single piece of stone, right? If that fact is in and of itself significant in the construction of these initial images in Egypt, and that idea is distinct from the idea of a pile or the building of a mound, and the singularity of the monolith also speaks its own iconology or iconographic language, then one could say that a construction, made of many stones is already a broken shaft of light. Is always already. So once these images are produced as constructed, from a multiplicity of materials, they are in some sense already recomposed from many broken stones, and in that sense, not authentic, right, to the monolithic image of the stone, and that may or may not be important, but if Barnett Newman is imagining, which I suppose he could be, that there exists a relationship between the monolithic and the monotheistic, then it's certainly important. And I wondered also about the breaking of these shafts of light in terms of the history of colonialism and theft, and we had that we almost accidental space-time coordinate with the word Bergam and its Latin roots and cognates in words like bourgeoisie and burglary, right? And if you look up obelisk in the Wikipedia site, you'll see how many of these obelisks, right? Here's one of the 2 Luxor obelisks on the Place de la Concorde in Paris. Why is it in Paris? Because it was stolen, right? It was stolen from Egypt by European colonialists. And isn't there a sense in which, stealing an object and moving it to Paris is breaking it, right? It's breaking it from its initial home. And certainly, if we think of it as a kind of relationship, to a holy space and a holy place, you can't move a holy space. And this is why we have so much contention around the possession and ownership, right, or occupancy occupancy of these, holy mountains and places, because to move them, is to break them. So that's one, and then here's another one. Pylon of the Temple of Luxor, with the remaining Luxor obelisk in front of. Okay, so this is one that remains, and the other one is precisely that one that we just looked at the Place de la Concorde in Paris. And I recently did a piece in which these they're still there. They're outside my door. Let me open up another window. A pair of morning cloaks, or Camwell beauties, as they're called in Britain, are cocooning right in front of my front door, and so I'm filming them, and these cocooning Nymphalis antiopa, are in the process of transformation, but for whatever reason, there are two of them, and one imagines that they have some kind of social relationship, to one another, to be in such close proximity. I suppose it could be accidental. And, as human beings, we tend to dismiss the sociality and intelligence of our fellow, earthly creatures. But clearly they seem to form a kind of pair. And as I situated them in this film, because I could have filmed any number of cocooning Nymphalis and Antiopa, but I chose these precisely because they were a pair, and because I wanted their representation in this configuration to represent a number. It seemed to me that they looked like two sets of the number 11, perhaps, or they could represent 2 and 2, or they could represent two designations of this number for 32. For 33, and hence, the number 863. But in any case, I did not choose to remove one of them and bring it to the Place de la Concorde in Paris, and the reason is because I respect the integrity of these fellow earthly creatures. And the transformation, that they're undergoing, and I want both of them to, if it's possible, and if the winds, that we're having here in Fort Defiance, in Arizona, don't remove them from their situation, which is entirely possible, and I have no control over, but I want them, to complete their transformation, where they are, and I don't mind observing them, but I have no intention of removing them from the place they chose to make this transformation, and the transformation itself, although again, this seems like an irrelevant aside, but symbolically the transformation, from the caterpillar into the butterfly, can be seen as a symbol, right, of a spiritual transformation from an earthly being to a being of sky, from a ordinary quotidian creature to something that represents the eternal, and in that sense, this is the moment of the transfiguration, right? The transfiguration, whether you related to the transfiguration of Christ or the transfiguration of any holy man, that again is a situation in which the one that crawls upon the earth suddenly becomes one that touches the sky, and in that way, this image is simply another way of representing, perhaps, that moment in which the mare, the mound, the primordial mound, the holy mountain, the one that is situated in the earth, touches the divine, before or after that touching is broken, by either the events of the human world or something else, and so in the history of these artifacts is also a history of breaking, and in this instance, it's a history not of breaking, by a tribal identification, with a particular nationalism, as was the case with Nazi Germans and their human destruction, but with an identification of colonialist ideology of exploitation of other cultures, and this idea that not only the English but other European cultures had that if a culture didn't have a particular form, right, of government and social organization, and then it was essentially not a culture at all, and hence could be quote in quotations discovered and owned by the Queen of England or the King of England or of whatever country that might have been, and the failure to understand the significance of these tekenu and the significance of displacing them, right, as breaking them. So this one stands, unlike the figures in the Barnett Newman, this one stands upright. But isn't there a conceptual sense in which, having moved it, it's already not standing upright? You understand what I'm saying? And the destruction, of its place, and its relationship with its partner is already a breaking. So it wouldn't matter if I took one of these Nymphalis Antiopa and placed it in whatever upright or upside down position. The mere act of displacing it would be inverting its meaning or miscomprehending the significance of its transformation and the symbolic value of that transformation and the holiness of its life, right? So but we're back to the Washington Monument. I think a lot, we put a lot into play, and we've certainly exceeded our hour limit. I wanted to say something about what Mircea Eliade says about the primordial mound and also the heavenly light, and I wanted to say something about that in relationship to the Barnett Newmans and an argument that could be made that's almost philological in relationship to the word mir and its connection to the primordial mound and axis mundi of the pyramid, and the word Meru as in Mount Meru. And I wanted to say that Mircea Eliade doesn't make that argument, that etymological argument, and I wanted to relate Eliade's failure to make that argument with perhaps his situation in relationship to another more philologically motivated mythologist, Ernst Cassirer, who does make those kinds of arguments. And certainly if Eliade, if Mircea Eliade were, let's say, if Mircea Eliade was Ernst Cassirer, he would have made this connection between the pyramids and Mount Meru, and he would have made it, philologically and based on the words and the cognates, in all of these different, Proto and Indo-European languages. But he doesn't, and I wonder, if that is in some way because he is moving away from what he perceives as no longer relevant, kind of archaeology of the sciences, and what he perceives in Cassirer as the failure of philology, to account for descriptive features as they evolve and move through different modes of we could say the human experience of the divine, and what makes that interesting is that the terms of comparative religion are in motion and in process in Eliade in ways that are perhaps much more relevant to our postmodern condition than those terms are made in some ways by Ernest Cassirer and other what I would call more traditional European takes on comparativism itself. And what and the way that I wanted to move those considerations back into the work of Barnett Newman was to suggest that Newman is even more radical in a certain respect than Eliade is, because he's willing to move back and forth across these representational time zones that involve the symbolic, the modern, the postmodern, and hidden and almost how would you put it, coded references to for example, the way that Hegel constructs a history of representation in the phenomenology of mind, and these representations of what clearly are historically informed and historically motivated images of the sublime that also act as critiques of in certain ways not only of the violence of history, but of the hidden violence of history in these colonially informed and constructed, colonially constructed arguments of evolution of the formal elements of art, as you see in Hegel. And in Eliade, there's a movement away from some of those constructiveness, but there's not a conscious criticism as I'm reading, and perhaps I'm over-reading, but reading into these broken obelisks by Barnett Newman. And again, part of my argument rests on what is stated in title and what is left in abeyance, what is stated in image and what is left abeyance, and what is stated in locus, and in this case loci, because there are many of these objects, and what is left in abeyance, and what is discussed in these pieces as they relate to many other obelisks and the monolithic construct of the stone, and the way that it's transformed into this materiality, which clearly is not that materiality, right? Because these are not stone. And if we go to the Wikipedia site, we can look up the material, and it's specifically 3 tons of core 10 steel, which acquires a rust-colored patina, and core 10 steel is in fact a trademark, and again, someone might say that I'm reading too much into it, but isn't there a sense in which if one imagines that there's a connection between this ineffable or at least somewhat immaterial shaft of light from the divine and its representation in nearly the opposite material, a single piece of carved stone, and that single piece of carved stone's relationship perhaps to another primordial image of a different, in a different context of the mound and the earth of the mound, that the transformation of that material itself into a genericized trademark, core 10 steel, is meaningful and an act of breaking, not in as horrible and irrecoverable a way as the Nazis broke the sacred symbol of the swastika, but it is indeed a breaking, and I think and I would argue that all of that is at work and at play in the Newman, and again that reading maybe is arguably right an overreading, but then I suppose I would challenge anyone that argues against it to demonstrate the why it's an overreading, and we could continue the conversation from there. This little section has little to do with what follows, has little to do with the Barnett Newman, but can kind of be regarded as a coda to what we're looking at. But on the Wikipedia obelisk site, if one is interested, one can follow the history of the movement of these various obelisks, and what I'm referring to as their displacements as examples of breaking, and in fact this Luxor obelisk that now exists in the Place de la Concorde in Paris was destroyed, broken, and removed by Napoleon, or in the Napoleonic campaigns in Egypt, and that history can be made available if you click on the Luxor obelisks link in the obelisk site and trace that history. But in fact, the history of the breaking of these Egyptian obelisks is much older than that, and within the obelisk site itself, the Wikipedia obelisk site, it mentions that around 30 BCE, Rome had seized control of Egypt, and that's familiar. Even if you don't know much about Roman history, you're probably familiar with that idea, via Shakespeare, and various plays that refer to Caesar's campaigns, some of the earliest obelisk destruction and the breaking of these symbols of light can be traced, back to the Romans, who not only, destroyed temples, but these sacred markers, as early as apparently as early as 300 BCE. Then some of these removals, or what I'm referring to as displacements of these symbols, were also performed by the Romans. It says here, the largest standing and tallest Egyptian obelisk is the Lantern obelisk in the square at the west side of the Lateran Basilica in Rome. And as readers and listeners of my pieces will recall and remember, I had suggested that as an act of reparation, Rome and the Holy Roman Church, could sell off the representations of the creation of Adam and also of the final judgment that are presented in the Sistine Chapel, Michelangelo's great works and works by other great artists. That they could sell these and they could use the money acquired in the sale of the Sistine Chapel, to support the hungry and the poor and the dispossessed and the displaced and those suffering from illnesses and other forms of oppression and destruction, human destruction. And that was a suggestion that I made regarding the Sistine Chapel, and then in relationship to this obelisk, there was another parataxia. Did I say parataxia? Okay, so I've made two parapraxial errors right in a row. First, I said obelisk, which was the first example of parapraxia, and then referring to parapraxia itself, I said parataxia, which is in fact a syntactical kind of syntactical relationship that's non-hierarchical, and not a parapraxia, which is the selection of one word for another mistaken word, for a mistake of one word for another. So two parapraxias right in a row. Wow. But in any case, I suggested that the Sistine Chapel could be sold, and the proceeds could benefit humanity and perform a truly Christian act of reparation in the spirit of the actual principles of Christianity, as opposed to those principles that have degraded into the collection of artifacts and objects. And I suppose I would make the same suggestion about the Lateran Basilica and the Lateran obelisk, since in fact it does originate in Egypt as an example of one of the Tikkenu that it could be returned as an act of reparation, and I suppose all of these other examples of stolen obelisks, right, not obelisks, could be returned as well, and so that's kind of coda.